Duplication, bugs, shotgun surgery, tedious testing. These are some of the symptoms of behavior leaking out of the domain. We can fix this by refactoring to push the behavior into the domain. It only takes 2 simple refactorings to get started. Let's walk through these refactorings with the well-known Nerd Dinner project. If you want to follow along, I'm using the MVC4 version. If you aren't familiar with the project, dinners are like meetups. Dinners are the domain we'll be working with. We'll be focusing on the behavior to RSVP. Let's take a look at the RSVP controller's register action. When an attendee RSVPs to a dinner, the action loads the dinner from the database. It checks if the attendee is registered, and if not, it adds them. Over in the dinner controller's create action, when a dinner is created, the host is also added to the RSVP list. These 2 actions are an example of the duplication that occurs when behavior begins to leak out of the domain. Let's refactor this code to move RSVPing behavior to the dinner model. The register action has some additional logic to check if the attendee is already registered, so let's start there. Then we'll be able to share this behavior with the code that creates dinners. To extract behavior, we need to look at dependencies. In other words, what variables we read from and what variables we write to or modify. Variables we read will become inputs to the extracted method, and the variables we modify will become outputs. Scanning the code, we find the first dependency, the attendee name. This comes from the user of the web request, stored in user.identity.name. We probably don't want our domain to be concerned with web frameworks, so let's introduce a variable for the attendee name and move it above the behavior we want to extract. I'll be using Resharper to demonstrate the value of these refactorings without worrying too much about the mechanics. Let's introduce an attendee name variable. We can use the refactor this menu in Resharper, activated by selecting the variable and using the shortcut Control-Shift-R, then selecting introduce variable. Resharper detects 2 usages. We'll choose to replace both. Notice it replaced both usages. As we scan the remainder of the code to extract, we notice a call to the database to save changes. This will only save the dinner to the database if the registration doesn't exist. This might be an optimization. When refactoring, it's important to focus on the clarity of the code and not let premature optimizations get in the way. Performance optimizations and refactoring occasionally result in trade-offs between performance and clarity of the code. If you're concerned about performance, talk with the rest of the team to see what the demands of the application are. Also, look for tests that explicitly verify any performance optimizations. In this case, we're going to trade performance for clarity. To decouple this, let's save the dinner at the end of every request. Now that we've decoupled our dependencies, we can extract a method to isolate the RSVP behavior. We'll use Resharper's extract method refactoring to automate this. To do this, we need to first select the code we want to extract, and then use the refactor this shortcut, Control-Shift-R, and then select extract method. We're prompted with a window to tweak the method we are extracting. At the bottom is a preview pane to show the new method. Name is the first option. Let's give this an intention-revealing name, RSVP, to indicate the action of RSVPing. Notice the preview updates as we change the name. Next is the method return type. In this case, we are executing a command, so there's nothing to return. Next are the input parameters to the method. Notice Resharper has identified 2 parameters, dinner and attendee name. It names parameters off of local variable names, which is why I like to introduce temporary variables, like with the attendee name, to give meaningful parameter names automatically. There's also accessor and static options. Since we want to create an instance method on the dinner model, let's change these to public and not static. Finally, click Next to execute the refactoring. And our new method appears. Before we move on, I'd like to tidy up the attendee name temporary variable. There's no need for this to remain. To do this, we can select the attendee name variable, activate the refactor this menu, Control-Shift-R, and select inline variable. And now we pass the current user directly to the RSVP method. We're halfway there. Extract method is the first of the 2 refactorings to push behavior into the domain. Now we can move this new method to the dinner model, the second refactoring. Resharper recently introduced a move instance method refactoring that greatly simplifies this process. This refactoring will move the RSVP method and update usages of the dinner parameter as if we had created the method on the dinner class to begin with. Look at the usages of the dinner parameter. Take note so you can compare to after the refactoring. To execute this refactoring, select the RSVP method and use the refactor this menu, Control-Shift-R, and select Move Instance Method. We need to pick which parameter we want to move the instance method to. In this case, we want to use the dinner parameter, and that's all there is to it. Notice the register action now calls RSVP as an instance method on the dinner model. And if we look at the dinner model, the RSVP method no longer has a dinner parameter, and calls to dinner properties and methods are updated as well. This is one of my favorite refactorings. It saves time and mistakes versus doing this manually. Now that we've moved the RSV behavior to the dinner model, we can reuse it when creating a dinner. Back in the dinner controller, the create action initializes the RSVP list and adds the host to it. Since we don't initialize the list in the RSVP method we just extracted, let's move the code to do that above what we want to replace. We're going to manually replace this code with our new RSVP method. Let's select the code that adds the RSVP and replace it with the code to dinner.rsvp. As a side note, since we manually made these changes, it'd be a good idea to exercise tests of this code. The automated refactorings from earlier should be tested too. Unfortunately, this code doesn't have tests that we can run. Instead, I'd suggest manually testing these actions. Another option would have been to introduce tests before we refactored. And speaking of testing, moving behavior to our domain actually tends to make testing much easier. Let's look at how we can add a test of our newly extracted behavior. To do this, let's add a test project, a class library, named tests. I'm going to use NUnit, so let's install that NuGet package as well. OK, let's rename the default class 1 to dinner tests. To do this, click the name and use the rename refactoring from Resharper. Control-RR is a shortcut. And we need to inherit from Assertion Helper and mark the class as a test fixture. OK, let's test that adding a new attendee results in the attendee being added to the RSVP list. I'm going to create a test method name to reflect this scenario. RSVP is the method we're testing, new attendee is the scenario, and our expectation is that the attendee is added to the RSVP list. The setup of our test involves the name of the attendee. Let's use Bob. And we need a dinner to RSVP to. We'll have to add a reference to the Nerd Dinner project. And now let's execute our RSVP method to add the new attendee. Last, we want to test that the attendee was added. So let's grab the only RSVP that should be in the list. Single will do this, and will cause an exception if there are multiple items. And then let's verify the RSVP's name. And now let's run our test. Boom, it fails. The RSVP list isn't initialized. We could fix this in our test setup, or we could use this test as an opportunity to initialize the RSVP list in the constructor of the dinner class. And now our test passes. Here's a comparison before and after our refactorings. Think about how we would have tested this method before we moved it to the dinner model. In the context of the MVC controller, we would need to stub the user property, the database lookup, and the database save. Also, we would need separate tests when creating a dinner and when registering, as both actions implemented this behavior. Moving behavior to the domain makes testing much more feasible. Not only does testing become easier, if we want to modify what's required to RSVP, say maybe cap the number of attendees, we have one place to make those changes now. When logic leaks out of the domain, it often becomes duplicated, requiring shotgun surgery to change, which results in code that is difficult to test and more prone to mistakes. Take the time to get the hang of the extract and move method refactorings. Study the manual steps, and then find an automated tool to appreciate. Start pushing behavior into the domain.